The collection of texts we now call the Bible was not delivered as a single, complete volume from the heavens. Instead, it is a product of centuries of writing, editing, debating, and compiling. Understanding its evolution reveals a fascinating journey through history, culture, and theological development. The books that make up both the Old and New Testaments were gradually chosen from a much larger pool of ancient writings. This selection process was complex and often contentious. Different communities held different texts as sacred, leading to a diverse landscape of early religious belief and practice before any standardized canon emerged. The concept of a fixed Bible is relatively modern when viewed against the long span of its creation. For much of ancient history, particularly during the time of the ancient Hebrew kings, there was no single unified scripture. Instead, various sacred scrolls existed, often with regional variations reflecting the beliefs and practices of different groups, such as the priests in Jerusalem versus those in Sikkim. These scrolls were living documents, subject to rewriting and reinterpretation as circumstances changed. Early Christians, too, navigated a sea of texts, with figures like the authors of the Gospel of Matthew citing scriptures so obscure that their full content and even titles are now lost to us, highlighting the fluidity of sacred writings in the nascent stages of the faith. The path to a recognized canon was neither straight nor swift. It involved centuries of discussion, disagreement, and eventual consensus building among various religious authorities and communities. The Old Testament's contents, largely drawn from Jewish scriptures, were written over a period stretching roughly 9 centuries, long after the time traditionally associated with Moses. Similarly, the New Testament's 27 books were not formally agreed upon until the late 4th century CE. This means that for the first few hundred years of Christianity, believers relied on a more varied and less defined set of sacred texts than what is commonly recognized today as the definitive New Testament. This evolutionary process underscores that the Bible is not a static artifact, but a dynamic library of ancient writings. Each book carries the imprint of its specific historical and cultural context, reflecting the concerns, beliefs, and theological understandings of its time. The journey from scattered scrolls and oral traditions to a bound collection involved intense debates about authenticity, divine inspiration, and doctrinal correctness. Recognizing this historical development is crucial for anyone seeking to understand the Bible's origins, its diverse contents, and its profound impact on Western civilization and beyond. It allows us to appreciate the human element intertwined with the divine in the shaping of these sacred scriptures. The Old Testament, or Tanakh as it is known in Judaism, forms the foundational layer of the biblical canon, yet its assembly was a protracted and intricate affair spanning many centuries. These scriptures were not authored by a single individual or at a single point in time. Instead, they represent a collection of diverse literary forms, including historical narratives, laws, poetry, prophetic utterances, and wisdom literature, composed and compiled by numerous authors and editors. The ancient Hebrews did not possess a single static Bible. Rather, they had a collection of sacred scrolls that were frequently revisited, rewritten, and reinterpreted over generations to speak to new contexts and challenges. The process of writing and editing these texts was complex. Scribes and editors played a significant role, often splicing together different source materials, cutting sections, and adding new passages to existing works. This editorial activity means that many books in the Old Testament are composite works, bearing the fingerprints of multiple hands and reflecting evolving theological perspectives. For instance, during the period of the ancient Hebrew kings, there wasn't a universally accepted collection of scriptures. Different religious centers, like Jerusalem and Sikkim, likely had their own preferred versions of certain texts, leading to regional variations in what was considered sacred or authoritative. Many of these original scrolls or variants are now lost to history. The development of the Old Testament canon occurred gradually, while some portions like the Torah, the first 5 books, achieved a recognized status earlier. Other sections, such as the prophets and the writings, took longer to be formally accepted as scripture. The final shape of the Hebrew Bible canon, as recognized by Judaism today, was largely settled by the early centuries of the Common Era. However, it is important to remember that this was a culmination of a long period of textual fluidity and development, not a sudden decree. The stories and laws within it had been transmitted and transformed for centuries before reaching their more or less final forms. Even after a general consensus on the core books emerged, debates continued about the status of certain texts. The Christian Old Testament itself varies between denominations. For example, the Roman Catholic tradition includes several books and editions, the deuterocanonical books or apocrypha, that are not found in the Protestant Old Testament, which typically aligns with the 39 books of the Jewish Tanakh. This divergence highlights the ongoing legacy of the complex and varied history of the Old Testament's formation, showing that even today, the boundaries of this ancient collection are understood differently by various faith communities. The New Testament, the collection of 27 books central to Christian faith, did not appear fully formed at the dawn of Christianity. Instead, its compilation was a gradual process that unfolded over several centuries, marked by extensive debate and the circulation of a wide array of writings. In the first few centuries after Jesus, numerous Gospels, letters, apocalypses, and acts attributed to apostles or other significant figures were written and used by various Christian communities. This period was characterized by a remarkable diversity of texts and theological viewpoints, with no single, universally accepted list of authoritative scriptures. Early Christians were deeply engaged with writings like the Enochian scriptures, which are now largely preserved only within the Ethiopian canon, indicating a broader literary world than what eventually became the standard New Testament. The task of sifting through these numerous writings to determine which ones were genuinely apostolic, divinely inspired, and doctrinally sound was a major preoccupation for church leaders in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. Intense debates raged as patriarchs and theologians grappled with questions of authenticity and heresy. For example, the Book of Jude was almost excluded from the New Testament by some because it cited the Book of Enoch and potentially another text, 2nd Esdras, which were ultimately not included in most canons. This demonstrates the meticulous and sometimes contentious scrutiny applied to each text before its acceptance. The criteria for inclusion often involved considerations of authorship. Was it believed to be written by an apostle or a close associate? Antiquity. Older texts were generally preferred. And orthodoxy. Did it conform to the prevailing teachings of the Church? It wasn't until the late 4th century that the 27-book canon of the New Testament, as it is widely recognized today, began to solidify. Councils such as the Synod of Hippo in 393 CE and the Councils of Carthage played significant roles in affirming lists of accepted books, but these were more of a recognition of growing consensus rather than the definitive starting point of the canonization process. Even then, some books like the Book of Revelation and the Epistle to the Hebrews continued to be debated in certain regions for some time before gaining universal acceptance. This lengthy period of discernment highlights the careful consideration given to the formation of the New Testament. The journey from a multitude of diverse writings to a defined canon shows that the New Testament was shaped by the collective wisdom, theological reflection, and lived experience of the early Christian church over many generations. The process was not arbitrary, but involved a deep engagement with the texts and their perceived connection to the life and teachings of Jesus and the early apostolic tradition. Understanding this historical context helps us appreciate the New Testament not as a monolithic entity dropped from heaven, but as a curated collection that emerged from a vibrant and often complex early Christian literary environment. The First Council of Nicaea, convened in 325 AD in the city of Nicaea, modern-day Iznik, Turkey, stands as a pivotal moment in early Christian history, though its role in directly shaping the biblical canon is often misunderstood. The primary impetus for this grand assembly, which gathered around 300 bishops and other clergy, was not to decide which books would be included in the Bible. Instead, Emperor Constantine the Great summoned the council primarily to address pressing theological controversies that were threatening the unity of the burgeoning Christian Church within the Roman Empire. The most significant of these was the Arian controversy, which centered on the nature of Christ and his relationship to God the Father. While the canon of Scripture was not the main agenda item at Nicaea, the Council's deliberations and decisions indirectly influenced the textual landscape of Christianity. According to some historical accounts, though not explicitly detailed in the formal creeds or canons of the Council, there was a discussion regarding various Gospels. It is reported that out of hundreds of Bibles or Gospels presented, the Council, specifically a group of 318 members, affirmed the four Gospels that strongly supported the divine aspect of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These accounts suggest that other Gospels, which perhaps offer different perspectives on Jesus' nature or teachings, were subsequently suppressed or even ordered to be burned, though concrete evidence for widespread destruction directly mandated by Nicaea is debated by historians. The Council's most famous output was the Nicene Creed, a statement of faith that articulated the Orthodox understanding of Christ's divinity, declaring him to be of one substance, homoousios, with the Father. This theological clarification had profound implications for which texts would be considered authoritative. Gospels and writings that aligned with the Nicene understanding of Christ were more likely to be favored and preserved by the mainstream church, while those deemed heretical, such as Gnostic Gospels that presented a different Christology, were increasingly marginalized. Thus, Nicaea's doctrinal decisions helped to create a theological framework that guided the later process of canon formation. It is crucial, however, to avoid the misconception that the Council of Nicaea definitively finalized the biblical canon. The list of New Testament books as we know it today was still being debated and would not achieve widespread consensus until later in the 4th century, through subsequent synods and the writings of influential church fathers like Athanasius. Nicaea's significance lies more in its efforts to unify Christian doctrine, particularly concerning the identity of Jesus, which in turn influenced the reception and authority attributed to various early Christian writings. Its focus was on theological unity rather than biblical compilation, though the two were deeply intertwined. Section 5. Constantine's Command, Imperial Influence on Sacred Texts. Emperor Constantine the Great, the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, played an undeniably significant, albeit complex role in the history of the Bible and the Christian Church. His conversion around 312 AD marked a turning point, transforming Christianity from a persecuted sect into a favored and eventually dominant religion within the Roman Empire. Constantine's interest in Christian unity was not purely spiritual. A unified church could contribute to a more stable and unified empire. This political dimension influenced his interventions in ecclesiastical affairs, including his commissioning of new copies of the Scriptures. This occurred shortly after the Council of Nicaea, around 331 AD. One of Constantine's most notable actions regarding the Scriptures was his order for the production of 50 copies of the Bible. These were to be prepared on high-quality parchment by skilled scribes for use in the principal churches of his new capital, Constantinople. Eusebius of Caesarea, a prominent bishop and historian, was tasked with overseeing this important project. While these 50 Bibles commissioned by Constantine were intended to be magnificent and authoritative, none of them are known to have survived intact today. Only small fragments are speculated to have come from these imperial copies. Their precise contents, particularly regarding which specific books were included, remain a subject of scholarly discussion. Some historical narratives, often critical in tone, suggest that Constantine's influence extended to the suppression of alternative Christian texts. It is alleged that in his drive for a unified Christian doctrine, earlier copies of Gospels that did not align with the emerging Orthodox view, particularly those that presented a less divine Jesus, were systematically destroyed. The 50 copies produced under his order, according to this perspective, became the new originals by default, shaping the textual tradition that followed. While direct evidence of Constantine personally ordering the destruction of all earlier Gospels is debated, the imperial favor shown towards a particular version of Christianity undoubtedly contributed to the marginalization and eventual loss of many alternative texts. It is important to note that Constantine's own unified canon, if such a specific fixed list existed as a direct result of his commission, has been lost to history. The Bibles we have today, while influenced by the textual traditions that solidified during and after his reign, are not direct descendants of those 50 imperial copies alone. The process of canonization was ongoing. However, Constantine's imperial patronage provided a powerful impetus for the standardization of Christian scriptures and helped to elevate the status of those texts that supported the theological consensus he championed, particularly the divinity of Christ as affirmed at Nicaea. His actions undeniably shaped the material and theological landscape in which the Bible continued to evolve. Section 6. The Quest for Originals, Manuscripts, Mysteries, and Alterations. One of the most compelling and often unsettling truths about the Bible is that none of the original manuscripts of its books, the actual parchments or papyri penned by the initial authors or their amanuenses, have survived the ravages of time. No living person has ever laid eyes on these autographa. What we possess instead are copies made by scribes over centuries, and these copies, often copies of copies, invariably contain differences. These variations range from minor slips of the pen, such as spelling errors or omitted words, to more significant alterations that can affect the meaning of passages. This reality means that the task of biblical scholarship involves a meticulous comparison of ancient manuscripts to reconstruct the earliest attainable forms of the texts. The earliest substantially complete or nearly complete manuscripts of the Bible that we have date to the 4th century CE, several hundred years after the books of the New Testament were originally composed. Among these, the Codex Sinaiticus, a magnificent Greek manuscript likely produced for a Roman emperor around the mid-4th century, is a prime example. This codex, discovered at St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai, is invaluable, yet it also reveals the fluidity of the text even at this relatively late stage. Scholars have identified approximately 25,000 alterations within its pages, made by various correctors over time. These changes include corrections of scribal errors, stylistic refinements, and even theological adjustments, such as the consistent alteration of Christos, meaning good or useful, to Christos, Christ, the Anointed One. Furthermore, Codex Sinaiticus originally contained 2 books, the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas, which were later excluded from the New Testament canon. The question of the Bible's original language, particularly for the New Testament, also presents complexities. While the oldest surviving manuscripts of the New Testament are predominantly in Greek, with some early versions also appearing in Aramaic and Syriac, this doesn't definitively prove Greek was the sole original language of composition for every book or saying. Conversations recorded in the Gospels, for instance, were likely spoken in Aramaic or Hebrew, the common languages of Palestine in the 1st century. There is an ongoing scholarly debate about whether some of the Gospels or their underlying sources might have first been written in Aramaic or Hebrew and then translated into Greek. However, no Aramaic Gospel manuscript has been found that predates the 4th century, and those that exist appear to be translations from Greek. For the Old Testament, the situation is also layered. While the bulk of it was written in Hebrew, with some portions in Aramaic, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, present a unique case. Given that Moses, traditionally considered its author, was educated in the Egyptian royal court and the Israelites spent a significant period in Egypt, some scholars have posited that these foundational texts, or their earliest sources, might have been recorded in Egyptian. The absence of original manuscripts means that such theories, while intriguing, remain speculative. The reality is that compilers of the Bible often claimed inspiration of scriptures long after the original texts were lost, working from the copies available to them, which already bore the marks of transmission and revision. Section 7. Saul's Transformation, Paul's Vision and His New Testament Letters. Saul of Tarsus, later known as the Apostle Paul, is arguably one of the most influential figures in the development of early Christianity and the shaping of the New Testament. His story is one of dramatic transformation. Initially, Paul was a zealous persecutor of the nascent Christian movement, reportedly acting as a bounty hunter who captured or even participated in the killing of early followers of Jesus on behalf of the authorities. His commitment to Jewish tradition led him to view the Christian claims about Jesus as blasphemous and dangerous. This background makes his subsequent conversion and dedication to spreading the Christian message all the more remarkable. The pivotal moment in Paul's life occurred on the road to Damascus. According to his own accounts and the narrative in the book of Acts, Paul experienced a blinding vision of the resurrected Jesus, who spoke to him and called him to become an apostle, specifically to the Gentiles, non-Jews. This encounter was profoundly personal and transformative for Paul. However, accounts suggest that those traveling with him did not experience the light or the voice in the same way, nor did they fall from their horses as he did. This was Paul's only claimed direct encounter with Jesus, and it fundamentally altered the course of his life, turning him from a persecutor into a fervent missionary. Following his conversion, Paul, in a sense, self-appointed himself as the 12th apostle, filling the symbolic vacancy left by Judas Iscariot after Jesus' ascension, when only 11 of the original disciples remained. He embarked on extensive missionary journeys throughout the Roman Empire, establishing Christian communities and articulating a theology centered on salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. His letters, written to these fledgling churches and individuals, form a substantial portion of the New Testament. Indeed, Paul is credited with authoring at least 13 and possibly up to 15 of the 27 New Testament books, making his writings the earliest Christian documents we possess, predating the Gospels. Paul penned his letters roughly between 50 and 60 AD, approximately 2 to 3 decades after the crucifixion of Jesus. This timing is crucial because it means his theological interpretations and narratives about Jesus were circulating widely before the Gospels were written. Church fathers have even suggested that the first 5 books of the New Testament, the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts, were either written by Paul or significantly influenced by his teachings and perspectives. This positions Paul not just as a prolific writer, but as a foundational theologian who created a new framework for understanding Jesus, developing what some describe as a new religion around a new Christ and a new Jesus, distinct in some ways from the immediate historical followers in Jerusalem. Section 8. Echoes of Jesus. The Gospels and their later composition. The 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which provide narrative accounts of the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus, were not written by eyewitnesses who walked alongside him. Scholarly consensus indicates that these foundational texts of Christianity were composed much later, approximately 60 to 80 years after Jesus' earthly ministry, placing their authorship generally between 90 and 110 AD. This means the writers were not the disciples whose names they bear: Matthew the tax collector, John the beloved disciple, Mark the companion of Peter, or Luke the physician and companion of Paul. Instead, the authors are more accurately described as second or third generation Christians, reporters of the traditions and rumors circulating within the early Christian communities. These gospel writers gathered stories, sayings, and miracle accounts that had been transmitted orally, and perhaps in some early written fragments, for decades. They then shaped this material according to their own literary styles, theological concerns, and the specific needs of the communities for whom they were writing. This process of compilation and redaction explains both the similarities and differences found among the Gospels. Each author presented a distinct portrait of Jesus, emphasizing particular aspects of his life and message. They were not simply chroniclers, but interpreters, crafting narratives that aimed to persuade and edify their respective audiences about the significance of Jesus Christ. The influence of Paul's earlier writings on the Gospel authors is a significant factor to consider. Paul's letters, penned decades before the Gospels, had already established key theological concepts about Jesus, such as his divinity, his sacrificial death, and salvation through faith. It is highly probable that the Gospel writers were familiar with Paul's teachings and that these ideas shaped their understanding and portrayal of Jesus' life and ministry. This implies that the narratives in the Gospels were, to some extent, filtered through the lens of Pauline theology, rather than being purely unadorned historical recollections from direct companions of Jesus. This understanding of the Gospel's authorship and timing means that a significant portion of the New Testament, including these crucial narratives in the Book of Acts, was written by individuals who had no direct physical connection to the historical Jesus. They never saw him, ate with him, talked to him, sat with him, or heard his teachings firsthand. Furthermore, these books were allegedly composed without the direct authorization, assistance, witnessing, documentation, or collaboration of the original apostles who were still living at the time, then in places like Antioch, Jerusalem, or Galilee, and who themselves did not produce written gospels. This highlights the complex interplay of memory, tradition, and theological interpretation in the formation of these sacred texts. Section 9. A Spectrum of Scriptures. The Divergent Paths of Belief. The historical journey of the Bible, from disparate ancient scrolls to the various canons recognized today, has resulted in a fascinating spectrum of scriptures and, consequently, a diversity of Christian beliefs. The intensive debates over authenticity, the influence of pivotal figures like Constantine and Paul, and the very human process of copying and translating texts have all contributed to this landscape. During Emperor Constantine's era in the early 4th century, for instance, numerous different Bibles and hundreds of Gospels were in circulation, reflecting the wide array of Christian sects and beliefs that had developed over the preceding 300 years. There was no single, universally accepted Bible at the time. This inherent diversity in the textual foundations has led to the existence of multiple versions of the Bible, each held as authoritative by different faith traditions. The Jewish Bible, or Tanakh, differs significantly in its canonical books from the Christian Old Testament. Within Christianity itself, the Roman Catholic Old Testament includes the deuterocanonical books, such as Tobit, Judith, and Maccabees, plus additions to books like Esther and Daniel, which are not found in the Protestant Old Testament. Protestant traditions generally limit their Old Testament to the 39 books of the Hebrew Tanakh, regarding the deuterocanonical texts as apocryphal, meaning useful for reading, but not for establishing doctrine. Beyond these major distinctions, Other Christian groups have their own unique scriptural interpretations or additional texts. For example, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has the largest biblical canon, including books like Enoch and Jubilees, which are not accepted by most other denominations. Groups such as Jehovah's Witnesses use their own translation, the New World Translation, which contains renderings that differ significantly from other Bibles on key theological points. Similarly, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, accepts the Bible as the Word of God as far as it is translated correctly, but also holds additional scriptures like the Book of Mormon as divinely inspired. The evolution of the Bible's canon, therefore, is not merely an academic footnote, but a crucial factor in understanding the varied tapestry of contemporary Christian beliefs and practices. The decisions made centuries ago about which texts to include or exclude, the interpretations offered by influential theologians, and the ongoing process of translation and textual criticism continue to shape how different communities understand God, Jesus, and the nature of faith. The Bible is not a monolithic book with a single undisputed meaning. Rather, its complex history has given rise to a rich and sometimes contentious plurality of scriptural traditions and theological perspectives that persist to this day, reflecting the dynamic and ever-evolving nature of religious understanding.